high. It says I can narrate about my life. I can present personal information about my life and activities using simple sentences most of the time.
Which is right out of the actual can-do statement.
Yeah, so we just took,
That's fine.
it just avoided so much argument and so much, it was just, those are some things that were very, specific. A 4 was can create a personal knowledge application task, a student designed assessment. 3 was, I can narrate about my life, about personal, we just took that. But some of the things we thought were pertained to those were daily activities, name, age.
Yep.
We would talk about the conjugation of brauchen and sein. A lot of kids get confused about whether it's EI or IE on spelling. Future tense, masculine and feminine articles would be the things that. And then a 2 would be the vocabulary, what they need to know, and then so.
Okay.
So he's creating a unit plan based on what the standard is. And as you can see, we go back to score 2, please. So you can see right here that for each unit, this kind of, the scale, he's giving the content of what he's going to cover there. Right here on
In the vocabulary.
Yeah.
Yeah, because that's
right there.
Knowledge and comprehension. We figured 3 would be analysis and 4 would be evaluation.
So
looking at that scale, I'm going to give you specific feedback on the scale right off the bat here. I think it's for the most part, really well-constructed proficiency scale. I don't have a problem with anything that you have in score 3.
Okay.
Because what you've done is you've articulated the specifics of narrate about my life using present personal information in that daily activities, name, age, conjugations, blah, 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 all of that stuff. Now what you're saying there is you are teaching and assessing each one of those bullets.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I don't have a problem with that whatsoever. Where I would push on your scale quality is at score 2. So will you go there? I'm concerned about the verb analyze, first of all, okay? The student will analyze and compare the, so what do you
that goes in 3, I'm sorry, that was a mistake.
what do you expect kids to be able to do with that vocabulary?
I just wanted to know the vocabulary.
So it's familiarity.
Yeah. Well, what we focus on, like, our sight words.
Yep.
High frequency words that.
So that analyze and compare
No, that
is
goes, that should go
okay,
up in
so
the
that won't be
That was a
there.
mistake.
So the part I would push on is what at score 3 needs to be further represented at score 2. Because I would argue that vocabulary, yes, it needs to be there. It is foundational knowledge, but there are almost 100% of the time additional skills that kids need to have. So if you'll go back to score 3, I'm going to see if I can come up with something.
The conjugations of Brock and Sein.
Yeah.
That's not represented in 2.
Yeah.
In the vocabulary, is it?
We have brauchs.
Okay.
We have the brauchs and
But-
brauche.
That's vocabulary, but it doesn't talk
You
about the
need, we've
conjugation.
talked about this before where we've actually said vocabulary is one part of score 2,
Yeah.
and then conjugations is another part of score 2.
Oh, I thought it would be more of an analysis. But yeah, that's why I put it there, is because you're analyzing something small,
Uh-huh.
like the conjugation. So okay, so
But
you're
more or
saying
less
that
you're
it should
producing
go.
actually.
I would push you to delineate additional simple content at score 2, thinking along the lines of what score 2 does is it positions kids for a higher likelihood of success at score 3. So what would be the additional basic foundational knowledge that would help to ensure that kids have success with I can narrate about my life, okay? The other thing that I would push on is that phrase most of the time. What does that mean?
I just took that from the
Yeah.
from the
Yeah.
statements.
Yeah, and I would eliminate it, and here's
Okay.
why. Because it lends itself to varying judgments being made. Because
I would highly
Yeah.
agree.
Uh-huh.
But that's
So
what we're
I
dealing
would get
with.
rid of it.
We're dealing with language that's so poorly written
Well,
compared to
so you
what you have in
clarify.
your book.
You clarify.
I like that.
Okay, you clarify,
I do.
use the standards as your basis, but I would just say, I can narrate about my life using present personal information and activities using simple sentences.
Oh.
Bam. And
I like
then
that so
when it
much.
comes to
Yeah.
an assessment, you will define what constitutes mastery.
Yes.
Yeah, phrases like most of the time are all over in our
You
Oh.
don't,
our
you don't
state.
want it.
Oh, it just drives
You
you
don't want it.
It
crazy.
drives us nuts.
Because what that's going to do is it's gonna cause you on the first day you score an assessment, well, 6 out of 10, is that most of the time it is, it's over half. And then the next
Yeah.
time you forgot that, yeah. Okay,
Yeah, we hate that also. So we're in 100%. We love what you said.
okay. So I think if you clarify a little more at score 2, all right? And the other thing I would ask you about is, you've got a lot of vocabulary there. Are those examples of terms that you'll address, or is each and every one of those going to be a requirement?
I would say they need to be a requirement because they are high frequency words.
Uh-huh,
These are words that are probably going to be spiraled throughout the curriculum,
got it.
and they're going to see them over and over and over again.
Mm-hmm,
Because they've done research like door versus the word K
mm-hmm,
in Spanish, which is a
Mhm.
high frequency.
mm-hmm.
In literature or on an AP exam, they're going to see K 3,500 times
Sure.
for every time they'll see door.
Mm-hmm.
So we want to focus on these because our, at least my philosophy is, if I can get into an AP vocabulary, there's 2,500 words, and that'll make up 95% of all literature.
Mm-hmm.
But the other 5% is like 200,000 words. So 2,500 or 200,000 words. So we're trying to focus on that vocabulary to make it viable, because we don't have like 6 years like I taught at a Utah school. They have like a program of 6 years.
Sure.
We don't have that. We have like
Sure.
4, so we have to be very specific in so I would say those are very high frequency
And that's
words.
not a problem whatsoever. You just know that
Yeah.
your vocabulary, and this is true in world language, you're kind of outside of the typical recommendation of no more than 7 to 10 terms on a proficiency scale, just because it's such a vocabulary-based content area. Okay, so I think we're getting someplace here in that, scales can be written at a lot of different levels, but I would push you hard to get your scale number down to 12 to 15. And that would mean that you might say to yourselves, within a certain unit of instruction, what do we address? And don't feel like you're locked into a single standard on a single proficiency scale, okay? Because you can give kids multiple.
About twice that.
Yeah. Okay, so that would be one thing. Now, you had another big point of question that you wanted to address.
Okay, well, another big issue, and that was our number one, but we got a little bit sidetracked, was alignment between, we are encouraged to align, but just like our first unit would be pronunciation. There's no way to align between languages.
So basically horizontal alignment from French to Spanish to German, teaching almost identical units so that we could go with common, we could do formative assessments more common and things like that. A couple of the different issues that we had identified is one, students are going to be at a natural advantage to learning Spanish versus French and German because Spanish is taught in the middle school. They already have a basics.
Mhm.
Spanish is spoken by their friends. Spanish is spoken on the radio station. Spanish is written everywhere. They eat at Mexican restaurants and see Spanish, and they hear Spanish pronounced constantly. Whereas French and German, we have that as a hurdle. Now, it doesn't mean that they're not as valuable languages, but it means that you can get a lot faster and you can go through a whole lot more content in Spanish, because of just some of the basic things.
Sure.
There are certain languages that are just harder to learn for an English learner in certain contexts. Listen, if I was in Quebec, I would be on cloud nine of being able to teach French. It would be great, you know. And you, Jeremy and Chad, you guys would struggle so much with Spanish, it wouldn't be funny, you know, because it would be a very different kind of environment.
So a
And,
question
yeah.
I have for you would be, would it be possible, and I see this in career and tech ed really, really frequently, that a course where it's bridge building versus a course that it's woodworking versus a course where it's welding, they've generated their proficiency scales as well as then their assessments to use more general language at score 3, and where the content is represented, aka the vocabulary and the basic knowledge and skill, that's where it becomes course specific. So it's kind of like those examples I showed you for world language from that other district, where they articulated at score 2 the vocabulary and then said they will apply it to likes and dislikes and phrases, whatever it might be. But at score 3, you probably noticed the generalness of their, because they use those exact same proficiency scales for German as well as their other language. So
Well,
the score 3 language becomes more generic in nature. The score 2 language is where you get your your course represented. So you would have yours French based, yours would be whatever languages you teach, German based, Spanish based at score 2, but score 3 it talks more about applying correct sentence structure, using the concept practiced. Doesn't matter what language it is, right? So my wonder is if you couldn't do that with this scale. It's
Well,
called German.
With our
but-
scales, we already have.
Uh-huh.
That's not the question. The question is now, we are feeling, for one reason or another, we're feeling a lot of pressure to align very specifically the content that we teach in Unit 1, the content that we teach in Unit 2, the exact words that we teach, the exact phrases and the ways we're teaching. Yes, as far as what we ask our kids to do, we're pretty consistent
Okay.
on, you know, like a French one, a Spanish one, and a German one kid should be basically doing the same thing at level 3. I mean, essentially, it's
Yeah.
similar to this,
Yeah.
or it's actually similar to the one that you showed us.
Yeah.
You know, at least that's the consensus that we have.
Yeah.
Is that they should be forming some basic simple sentences at level 3, and level 1 and 2 are more vocabulary and grammar parsed out. Right? The question we have on curriculum alignment is we feel like there's a lot of pressure and a lot of push on us to be exactly the same topics, so talk about some of the exact same things, and I guess it's, you can cover a lot more, especially at the beginning with Spanish. I mean, French has a pronunciation barrier that just takes more time for students to get over. You know, same with German. German has certainly a lot of those things. It's like, it's just a barrier. It doesn't mean that kids can't learn it. But then if you're expecting us to cover 8 topics and you're covering the world languages and you're covering the body parts and you're covering that, and you all have to cover all of those, that's where we're running into the
Got
issues
it.
of
Yeah.
trying to get content, because that's, as far as what we expect kids to do, we think that we're pretty well
Yeah,
aligned.
We just,
It's
for the
just trying to
purpose
get
of
content.
PLC work,
We don't know
and
what to
when
do
we're
with
in
PLC
different
work sometimes.
different languages, like if you look up, for example, California, they'll state Spanish and French languages have a lot in common with English. So to reach a certain level of proficiency, it takes about 600 hours. Whereas to reach the same level of proficiency in German is 900 hours. To reach the same, just because the grammar structures, the vocab, the pronunciation, and all of those are so different from English, that to cover the same, be able to do the same tasks, essentially reach the same level on the standards, takes a lot more contact time with the different languages.
So I would love to have Merle or Doug respond to that.
So here's my thought, I'm
that
a language
concern.
teacher too,
Uh-huh.
I was a Spanish teacher. There's nuanced differences with each of them, right? But they're all romantic languages, so they can be, to some degree, right? And they're kind of heading, they can be more similar than they need to be different. Does that make sense? What we don't wanna have is you guys being all over the place with how you're attacking your units. I think they can be fairly similar. You're gonna have differences in French. You're gonna be attacking different verbs, and pronunciation can be harder here. I mean, there's nuanced differences for sure within the language, but I think there's a lot more in common than there is probably differences.
Here's what I would encourage you to do, and it's just simply because I know we're out of time. And I do think this is very, very plausible. I think what I would do is, because of what you said in relation to the proficiency scales being pretty common across all languages, that's a beautiful first start. But what if you were to say, and maybe you've already done this, let's start with the end in mind, being that common assessment that we would give at the end of teaching a unit. Not right now being concerned about amount of time needed. Right now, not being concerned about that. But crafting a common assessment such that it doesn't matter the language. You'll plug in the specifics of the language in the Score 2 content, but when it comes to Score 3, you're pretty much asking them to do the same thing, just in the language that you represent. If you could start with just that one common tool, I think that will give you a great place then to think about how else might we align our classroom practice, knowing there's going to be, to Merle's point, some differences. There is.
And the only place that I think that they're gonna have common assessments is within Spanish, right?
Okay.
Common
That's
assessment.
good.
I mean, they're gonna be similar, they've gotta be similar if your unit design is similar,
Yeah.
but you're gonna have the nuance differences of the
But
language.
the thing we get concerned with is if we need to be doing PLC, we need to be on kind of a similar time frame, which I tried a German class, and it was a lot more difficult to learn German in a class setting than the way I learned, well, and I learned Spanish in class too, but there's just huge differences, you know, from
No, there are.
my experience
And we
and
know that.
We're trying to figure out what to do during our PLC time.
Yeah, well, I don't think there's a
That's
thing
something we
wrong
really have.
with bringing an assessment that you've created to the same proficiency scale and giving one another feedback on that. I don't think there's anything
Yeah.
wrong with coming and talking about instructional strategies that you're using as you teach kids you're all teaching kids vocabulary, right? So look for those common threads and plan your PLC time around what is common right now. And my belief is as you continue to look at that which is easy to identify that's common, you'll identify other things that are also common. Because if you have a challenge with it in German, you likely have had a challenge with it in French, and you've likely had a challenge with it in Spanish. So you can, how do you get kids to understand blah, blah, blah? You might get some really great input from your colleagues that teach another language, is all I'm saying.
Yeah, it's just difficult when his is like concurrent enrollment, his is AP, German is just beginning.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
so hard to,
The German one, the Spanish one, and the French one are gonna be all similar.
And another thing you might do, gentlemen, is to start with, you gotta
More
start
similar than
somewhere.
different.
You might say, let's
When you get
take our
into your more
PLC
advanced stuff,
time
that
and
makes
let's
sense.
divide it a
Yeah.
third, a third, a third. A third of the time is gonna be spent on Spanish, a third of the time on German, a third of the time on French. And you as individuals have to bring your specific questions to your colleagues to get their input and to get their expertise at that point in time. So think outside of the box of what might be happening in English 10 or what might be happening in biology, because there are nuances. So look for how you can use that time to benefit
Every
you.
training that we ever have on a district-wide or even a school-wide level is assuming that that process is going to work for us. And so we end up sitting through 3 hours of training trying to go through the traditional PLC process of common formative assessments and what are we going to do when they learn it. And it is a little bit frustrating because it doesn't really apply to the process that we've created in the
So
board.
create your process is what I'm gonna
I'm-
encourage you to
right.
do. Create your process
Which
within
we
the
are
request of
working on,
the.
it's just we're trying to find
resources and district things. And there's more singletons in this district and more singletons in this school than you could think of, than there are people who work in a department that they can
No, I
actually
know, and that
collaborate
makes
in
it
the same way.
challenging. It does,
So,
it makes it challenging. I agree with you on that.
Has to be said. No, thanks, guys.
Well, we know
I
that.
appreciate that.
Thank you. Thanks for being here.